Phân tích hook hiện tại, đoạn mở đầu hiện có. By the 6th hour of my shift, the pain in my lower back was a constant, unwelcome companion. Each step across La Fenice's polished marble floor was an agony. Đánh giá, không có hook hiệu quả vấn đề. Bắt đầu quá chậm với mô tả đau lưng, không ai quan tâm. Không có tension trong 30 giây đầu. Thiếu câu hỏi, gạch chéo teaser để giữ chân khán giả. Mặt 2 đến 3 phút, he had a knife strapped to his arm, and he was walking straight toward the most powerful man in New York. I had 3 seconds to make a choice. 3 seconds to decide if I was going to risk my life for a stranger, a man whose name was whispered in fear across every Italian neighborhood in the city. I was nobody, just a waitress with flour-stained hands and aching feet, but I saw what no one else could see. And in that moment, I discovered something terrifying about myself and about a secret that had been buried for over. This is the story of how I saved a mafia king and accidentally unlocked a century-old promise that bound our families together through blood, war, and a love that transcended generations. His name was Matteo Duca. He controlled empires from the shadows, and he had no idea that the woman pouring his wine was the only person standing between him and death. By morning, I would lose everything I thought I knew about my family, and I would find a destiny I never knew was waiting for me. This story will remind you that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act when every part of you wants to run. Sometimes, the moment you trust your instincts is the moment your entire life changes forever. If stories about fate, fearless women, and unexpected love speak to your soul, hit that like button now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another story. Now, let me take you back to that night at La Fenice, where it all began. By the 6th hour of my shift, the pain in my lower back was a constant, unwelcome companion. Each step across La Fenice's polished marble floor was an agony, a dull throb resonating through muscles that had no memory of rest. The heavy scent of fresh basil and slow-cooked tomato sauce clung to my uniform like a second skin. It mingled with faint splashes of expensive wine from the dinner rush. On my left arm, I balanced 3 plates of ossobuco. I had to navigate a maze of tables occupied by men in suits worth more than my rent, and women whose diamonds glittered under the soft light of crystal chandeliers. La Fenice was a world where I only ever belonged as part of the staff. It was a restaurant nestled in a brownstone on Arthur Avenue, owned by the Caruso family for 3 generations. The place had become the chosen gathering spot for every significant Italian family in the Bronx, and even further. Its walls were adorned with old photographs of Naples, showing fishing boats and sun-drenched coastlines, just like the ones my Nonna Caterina described in her bedtime stories. I was raised on those stories, on the music of the Neapolitan dialect, and the aroma of her ragu simmering all day on Sundays. But now, I served that same ragu to people who never once met my eyes, their focus only on the food I delivered. Julia, table 12 is ready for their check, and the private room requires another bottle of Barolo. Marco, the floor manager, materialized at my side, his clipboard a permanent extension of his arm. His eyes scanned the dining room like a predator seeking its next meal. He was a compact man with thinning hair and a constant film of sweat on his brow, the type who fed on the stress of others. "We have a new person tonight. Antonio reported he was sick, so the agency sent a replacement. Watch him. Make certain he does not create a problem for us." I gave a slight nod, placing the ossobuco on table 7 with a well-rehearsed smile before my eyes drifted to the service station. That is where I saw the new waiter. He was tall with broad shoulders, his dark hair cut short against his scalp. His entire bearing suggested a military background, not a career in food service. His large hands seemed clumsy as he struggled with a wine opener, his fingers too thick for such a delicate task. The way he carried himself sent an uneasy warning signal up my spine, an instinct I had learned to trust after years of living in neighborhoods where your gut feelings kept you safe. The dining room was filled with the low hum of conversations in both Italian and English, punctuated by the clinking of glasses and the soft melody of Puccini from unseen speakers. I moved through the restaurant like a phantom, topping off water glasses, taking away finished plates, and fulfilling requests before they were even spoken. This was a craft I had honed over 3 years at La Fenice, this talent for being present but unnoticed, for providing service without being an intrusion. My nonna would have been impressed by my work ethic, though she would have mourned the reasons I was here. The Romano family had apparently been important in Naples, but the war had thrown us to different corners of the world. Caterina used to tell me of large homes and sprawling olive groves, of family alliances built over generations, and debts of honor that were worth more than money. I had always thought they were just stories. The kind of beautiful lies that elderly women tell to make their poverty feel less final. But occasionally, when I was serving particular guests, those with old family names and even older fortunes, I would see a flicker of recognition in their expressions. It was as if they were looking at me, but seeing the ghost of someone else's face. Tonight, the private room was occupied by a group that was spoken about only in hushed tones. Marco called it the Duca table, and he said the name with a reverence that was laced with fear. Matteo Duca was not a man you read about in the papers or saw on the television. He conducted his business in the shadows, where his influence was a force you felt instead of saw. You could measure his power by the immediate silence that consumed a room when he walked in, not by any noise he made himself. I had never been assigned to his table. That privilege was given only to the most senior servers. But I had observed him from afar, noticing how other powerful men would yield to him, how his presence alone seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the room. Suddenly, the new waiter dropped an entire tray of glasses near the kitchen entrance. The crash sliced through the restaurant's ambient sound like a gunshot. I flinched, watching him hurry to pick up the broken glass, his movements awkward and panicked. Marco was on him in an instant, hissing angry words in rapid Italian that the new man clearly could not comprehend. Another alarm bell went off inside my head. What kind of staffing agency sends a waiter who cannot speak Italian to work at La Fenice? I delivered the bill to table 12, cleared the used wine glasses from the bar, and found myself moving unconsciously toward the service station. The new man was there, pretending to fold napkins. From this closer distance, I could see the hard line of his jaw and the way his eyes kept darting toward the private room. Matteo Duca was in that room with his men. The man's stare was not the curious look of someone impressed by being near a powerful figure. It was the focused, assessing gaze of a hunter locked on his prey. A sudden chill ran down my spine, and it was not from the air conditioning. I positioned myself by the coffee machine, polishing glassware that was already spotless, all while watching the stranger out of the corner of my eye. I noticed his jacket did not hang correctly on his left side. There was a slight bulge that most people would overlook, but it was something I recognized. I grew up in the Bronx. I knew boys who carried weapons in their waistbands, and men who ended arguments with something more final than words. As he reached for a clean stack of napkins, his sleeve pulled up just far enough for me to see the glint of metal strapped to his forearm. It was a knife, hidden under his shirt, placed perfectly. My hands began to shake as I put the glass down. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I tell Marco? He would demand that I explain myself and waste critical moments doubting my story. Should I call the police? They would not get here in time to stop anything. Besides, La Fenice had arrangements with certain law enforcement that made official help a very messy option. I was not aware of their secret rules, and I did not know if my intervention would be seen as a threat instead of a warning. The stranger was already on the move. He had dropped the act of working and was now walking toward the corridor that led to the private room. His hands slid inside his jacket, his fingers wrapping around something I could not see but knew was there. Time slowed down, stretching between the frantic beats of my own heart, each one pounding in my ears like a war drum. I grabbed a large wine jug from the service counter and a pen from my apron. With frantic urgency, I wrote a message across the palm of my hand. The ink smudged on my damp skin, but the words were still readable. They had to be. I started walking toward the private room, projecting an air of confidence, as if I had every reason to be there. I forced my server's smile onto my face, hiding the terror that was clawing at my throat. The stranger was right in front of me, his pace increasing, his deadly purpose now undeniable. I hurried past him with a quick muttered "Scusi," making sure I entered the room ahead of him. I walked straight to the head of the table where Matteo Duca was seated. He glanced up as I came near, and I finally saw his face up close. He had a strong jawline covered in faint stubble and dark, intelligent eyes that held a hard glint beneath the surface. His high cheekbones looked like they were carved from marble. It was a face from a Renaissance painting, both beautiful and incredibly dangerous. His dark hair was styled back in the classic Italian way. A silver watch shone on his wrist, and the collar of his fine shirt was unbuttoned just enough to show a gold chain against his olive skin. I raised the heavy wine jug with my left hand and started to pour. I deliberately angled my body so that my right hand, palm open, was facing him directly. The urgent message I had written on my skin was visible only to him. It read, "Fake waiter, you're the target tonight. Run." His eyes lowered to my hand, and I saw the moment of understanding register in his mind without any outward sign. His eyes did not widen. He did not gasp. There was no hint of alarm. He simply read the words on my palm. Then, he raised his gaze back to mine with a power that stole the air from my lungs. For 3 seconds that felt like a lifetime, I was a complete stranger who had just gambled everything to warn a man I did not even know. He was a man whose very life now hinged on trusting the warning from a waitress he had never seen before. In that brief span of 3 seconds, a silent understanding passed between us. It was a different kind of recognition, a mutual respect for a brave act that existed outside of our situations. Then, with casual grace, Matteo Duca picked up his napkin, patted his mouth, and stood up from the table as if he had just recalled an urgent phone call he needed to make. He spoke briefly to his men in a dialect that was too quick for me to understand. And then he was gone, walking calmly toward a side exit, his pace unhurried even as death was closing in on him. I kept pouring the wine for the men still at the table. My hands were perfectly steady now that the danger had passed, but my heart was pounding against my ribs hard enough to shatter them. I heard the stranger behind me swear under his breath. I heard the sound of shuffling feet as he understood his target was gone, followed by Marco's bewildered questions about why the private party had ended so abruptly. The immediate threat was over. The moment had passed. But as I finally escaped to the kitchen to steady my breathing, I felt a deep and certain knowledge that something had not ended. Something had just begun. The rest of my shift was a complete blur of robotic actions and empty smiles, my body on autopilot while my mind kept replaying those 3 critical seconds. The same few seconds played over and over in my mind, a constant looping nightmare. The true weight of my actions began to crush me, settling in like a heavy winter snow. With every passing minute, the reality of what I had done piled higher, until the pressure made it almost impossible to breathe. I had warned a powerful Mafia boss that his life was in danger. I had stepped into a world that was not mine, a place where debts were settled with violence and favors were tied to prices I could never hope to pay. The stranger who prompted my warning had vanished soon after Matteo departed, melting away through a kitchen exit while Marco was caught up in the commotion from the private. Nobody even noticed he was gone. Agency staff were like ghosts, their faces temporary and easily forgotten in the endless cycle of restaurant workers. But I knew I would never forget his face. I would remember the cold, empty calculation in his eyes and the way his hand had drifted toward the hidden weapon at his side. I would replay that moment and wonder just how close I had been to seeing something that could never be undone. By the time I finally punched the clock at 11 o'clock, My entire body ached with a deep weariness, and my uniform was saturated with the smells of garlic and exhaustion. The October evening had grown frigid, and a bitter wind sliced right through the flimsy jacket I'd chosen that morning, when the day still held the last gentle warmth of autumn. I shoved my way through the heavy side door and into the dark alley, my mind already mapping out the subway trip home, trying to figure out how many precious hours of sleep I could get before my morning class at the community college. But a black car, idling silently at the alley's entrance, brought me to a dead stop. It was long, sleek, and impossibly expensive, the type of car you only see in movies about men with too much power and the women who were reckless enough to get close to them. Its engine was a low, confident hum that whispered of precise German engineering and lavish Italian design. The windows were tinted so darkly that they hid whatever secrets, or people, were waiting inside. My grip on my bag's strap grew painfully tight as a primal instinct screamed at me to run, to turn back and find any other way out, to act like I had not seen a thing. And then, the back door swung open, and Matteo Duca emerged. He looked like a completely different man, away from the glittering chandeliers and crisp white linens of La Fenice. He had shed his suit jacket. The sleeves of his pristine white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, showing powerful forearms covered in muscle, and an intricate tattoo that snaked from his wrist to his elbow, its design a mystery in the faint light. A thick gold chain rested against his throat, catching the glow from a nearby street lamp. A heavy signet ring on his right hand, marked with a crest I did not know, flashed as he casually leaned against the car. "Signorina Romano," he said. The sound of my sent a tremor through my body that had nothing to do with the biting cold. His Italian was perfect and smooth, carrying the distinct rhythm of someone who grew up speaking the language, not learning it from books. You disappeared before I could properly thank you. I remained frozen in place, carefully preserving the space between us, as if it were a shield against what might come next. I was only doing my job. His laugh was a quiet, surprising sound. Your job is to serve the wine, not to save a man's life. That is a different kind of work entirely. He pushed himself off the car, taking one deliberate step in my direction. Against my own will, I took a matching step back. A small smile played on his lips, telling me he saw my fear and was perhaps a little entertained by it. I am not going to harm you, Julia. I am here to show my gratitude. Hearing him use my first name was a shock. How do you know my name? I know everything about every person who works inside that restaurant. He wasn't boasting when he said it. He was stating a simple, unchangeable fact. Background histories, family connections, personal finances. It is how I survive in my particular profession. His eyes were dark pools, impossible to read, and they held my gaze with a power that twisted my stomach into a knot. Julia Romano, age 23, a student at Bronx Community College, pursuing a degree in business administration, and raised by your grandmother, Caterina Romano, after your parents were killed in a traffic accident when you were only 7 years old. You are currently living in a studio apartment on Tremont Avenue, and you are 3 months late on your rent because of a delay with your financial aid. The cold, precise listing of my private life felt like a deep violation, as if every piece of me had been taken, exposed, and studied under a sterile, unforgiving light. You have been watching me. I watch everyone. He took another step, closing the distance between us. This time, I forced myself to stand my ground. But until tonight, you were only a name on a piece of paper. Now you are the woman who noticed what no one else did and who chose to act when everyone else would have stayed silent. That, Julia Romano, makes you very interesting. The way the word interesting rolled off his tongue made my heart beat faster in a way I refused to analyze. I do not want to be interesting to you. Desire has almost nothing to do with this. He reached into his coat pocket, and my body went rigid, expecting him to pull out a weapon, no matter what he had just said. Instead, he withdrew a business card. It was made of thick, cream-colored paper with a single phone number embossed in brilliant gold leaf. The man you saw this evening works for a rival group that has been attempting to remove me from my position for months. They have murdered 3 of my associates. They have burned down 2 of finally reaching their objective. His voice was completely calm and conversational, as if he were talking about the weather instead of assassination and murder. You prevented that. I am in your debt. I stared at the card he held out, but I made no move to accept it. I do not want anything from you. Every person wants something. He moved even closer, so near now that I could smell the scent of his cologne. Sandalwood mixed with something darker, richer, and far more expensive. I could see the thin, pale line of a scar that traced his jaw. Protection, money, a new opportunity. You have been fighting to survive for many years, Julia. Battling all alone in a world that rarely rewards such a struggle. I have the power to change all of that. His offer was a tangible thing hanging in the air between us, a beautiful object that shimmered with both promise and extreme peril. I thought of my grandmother's old stories, tales of the Romano family's faded glory and the sacred debts of honor that had governed her entire life. I thought of the stack of overdue rent notices on my small kitchen counter, the expensive textbooks I knew I could not afford, the future I felt myself slowly drowning while trying so desperately to reach. Why? The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Why would you offer to help a person you do not even know? For a moment, something in his expression changed, revealing a small crack in the perfect mask of control he always wore. Romano, he said again, almost as if he were savoring the name. My nonno used to tell stories about that. He always said that the Romanos and the Ducas were close allies back in the old country, before the Great War scattered our families across the ocean. He said they were people of true honor, people who would stand by their word when all others had broken their promises. His dark eyes scanned my face, searching for a sign of something I could not begin to understand. When I first saw your surname on the employee list, I thought it was just a coincidence. But now, I am starting to believe it might have been something more. The very notion that our families might have been linked together for generations, that some twist of destiny or simple chance had led us to this dark alley, was far too much to comprehend. I just shook my head, taking another small step back toward the relative safety of the restaurant's shadows. I do not believe in destiny. Neither did I. He made no move to follow me. He did not press his point. Until tonight. A door creaked open somewhere down the alley. The sound of cheerful voices broke the silence of the night as more of my co-workers ended their shifts. The intense spell of our private moment was instantly broken, and I was suddenly, painfully aware of how exposed we were standing there, how easily this entire conversation could be misunderstood by anyone who happened to see us. I have to go, I said, turning my body toward the street. Julia. My name, spoken by him, stopped me more completely than any wall ever could. The man who tried to kill me tonight will not be the last one. They know that you were the one who warned me. They have eyes and ears everywhere, always watching, always waiting. You are no longer safe. I should have been paralyzed with fear, but instead, a strange sort of calm washed over me, as if some hidden part of my soul had been waiting for a moment just like this, preparing for it its whole life without me ever realizing why. I have never been safe, I told him softly. That part is not new. Then allow me to offer you something that is, he said, holding out the card once more. Protection. There are no strings attached, no hidden obligations, just the security of knowing that someone is watching over you. Why would you ever do that for a complete stranger? His smile was faint and held a trace of sadness. Because my grandfather would have insisted on it. Because a Romano saved his life once, many years ago. And a Duca always repays his debts. He gently pressed the small card into my palm, and his fingers felt warm against my freezing skin. Think about my offer, and when you are ready to speak, you can call that number at any time, day or night. Before I could even think of a reply, he was already moving back into the car, the heavy door closing behind him with the soft, solid sound of expert machinery. The engine hummed back to life, and just like that, he was gone. His taillights vanished around a distant corner, leaving me all alone in the sharp October cold, with a single business card that felt like it was burning a hole in my hand, and 1,000 questions multiplying in my mind faster than I could ever hope to count. I did not make the call that night, or the next night, or even the night after that, but I held onto the card. And with every walk to the restaurant, every ride home on the subway, every single time I laid awake in my small, lonely apartment, listening to the endless symphony of the city, I felt a new set of eyes on me that had not been there before. They were always watching, always waiting. I could not tell if they belonged to Mateo's men or to the enemies he had described. The only thing I knew for certain was that my entire life had been changed forever in the space of just 3 seconds, and a warning scrawled on my hand. There was no way to go back to being the person I had been before. 3 long weeks went by before our paths crossed again. The days had begun to feel strange and unsettling. My normal, ordinary life was now broken up by sudden bursts of intense, hyper-aware paranoia that left me completely drained. I started seeing things that I had never given a second thought to before. I saw the same dark car parked on the street across from my apartment building for 2 days straight. I noticed a man who stood for too long near the subway station entrance. I could feel the undeniable weight of being watched, even when I could not see who was doing the observing. Mateo had told me I was not safe anymore. And though I had initially brushed his words off as some kind of dramatic exaggeration, the slow creep of reality was starting to prove him right. Someone had broken into my apartment while I was away at my classes. Nothing of value had been taken, because I had nothing of value to steal. But all of my drawers had been pulled open, my papers had been rifled through, and the simple order of my grandmother's photographs were in disarray. The people who searched my apartment were professionals, leaving behind no fingerprints and no damage. There was nothing I could tell the police that would not make me sound like I was losing my mind. But I felt the violation deep in my bones. The thought that strangers had handled my belongings, breathed my air, and occupied my space was unbearable. That evening, I finally dialed the number on the business card. He was there in less than an hour. The knock on my door was soft, almost hesitant, not the forceful breach I had been bracing myself for. When I pulled the door open, Mateo was standing in my small hallway. He looked completely out of place in his tailored coat and leather shoes, framed by my peeling paint and the flickering overhead light. His face was a mask of careful neutrality, but I saw a flicker in his eyes the moment he saw me, a recognition of the fear I was trying so hard to conceal. He asked, "May I come inside?" I moved to the side, allowing him into a room that suddenly felt smaller and more inadequate, because he was in it. He offered no comment on the water stains spreading across the ceiling, the second-hand furniture, or the bare walls I had never found the time to decorate. Instead, his eyes scanned the room with a practiced efficiency, identifying every entry point, every line of sight, and every potential weakness. "When did this occur?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "Today, while I was at the university." I hugged myself, a sudden chill running through me even though the radiator was working. They went through all of my things, my Nona's letters, my pictures, even my notes from class. My voice broke on the final word, and I despised myself for showing such weakness. "Why would anyone do this?" "They are searching for leverage," he said. He turned to look directly at me, and for the first time, I could see real anger in his eyes. It was not a cold, controlled anger, but something fiery and personal. "They want something to use against you if you become a problem. Proof of secrets, of connections, of anything that could make you vulnerable." He stopped for a moment, carefully observing my face. Did your grandmother leave anything to you? Any documents, letters, or items from the old country? The question took me by surprise. Only her jewelry box and a few photographs, nothing of any real value. May I look at them? There was a quality in his voice that made me pause, but I guided him to the small chest on my dresser. It was a wooden box carved with flowers, the one my Nona had brought from Naples when she came here at 17 years old. I lifted the lid, showing him the simple contents. There was a string of glass beads, a silver ring dark with tarnish, and a faded picture of a young woman standing in front of a villa I did not recognize. Matteo lifted the photograph with a surprising reverence, angling it toward the light as if he were trying to find hidden clues in the old sepia image. His expression shifted in a way that was subtle but completely clear. He recognized it. He was surprised. And there was something else, something much deeper that I could not identify. "Do you have any idea what this is?" he asked, his voice sounding unusually rough. I shook my head no. My Nona never spoke about her life in Italy. She would tell me stories, but they were never about her own family and never about the reasons she left. I just assumed the memories were too painful for her. He placed the photograph down with care, his fingers resting on the edge for a moment longer than necessary. "This villa belonged to my family, 3 generations back, before the war." He paused, and when his eyes met mine, there was a new understanding in them. It was a look that made my heart start to pound inside my chest. "And the woman in this picture," he continued, "she was my great-grandmother's dearest friend. Her name was Caterina Romano. She was your grandmother." The words took a few seconds to truly sink in. When they finally did, the entire room felt like it was spinning. "That is impossible. Read the message written on the back." My fingers trembled as I picked up the photograph and flipped it over. In faded ink, there was a line of Italian script that I had never seen before. "Per Inseo al fine C.R. Napoli, 1938. Forever together until the end. C.R. and L.D." "Lucia Duca," Matteo said in a quiet voice. "My Nona's mother. She and your grandmother were as close as sisters. When the war started and their families were forced to separate, they made a promise to protect each other's descendants, no matter what happened to them." I slowly sat down on the edge of my mattress, clutching the photograph. I was trying to make sense of this new information, which changed everything I believed about my own family. My grandmother had never once mentioned the Ducas, never gave any clue about a connection that spanned generations. She had raised me on tales of Naples, but she always presented it like a distant storybook land, not as a part of a living history that could one day find me. "Why did she never tell me?" I whispered. Matteo came and sat beside me. He was not close enough to make contact, but I could still feel the warmth coming from his body. "She was probably trying to protect you." The reputation of the Duca family became much darker as the years went on. "She might have hoped that by keeping you unaware, she could also keep you safe from the world she managed to escape." I remembered the look on my Nona's face when I told her about getting the job at La Fenice. I recalled the strange emotion that crossed her features just before she smiled and wished me success. Is it possible that she knew? Did she suspect that working in that restaurant could lead me to the very family she had spent her whole life trying to avoid? "This changes nothing," I declared, trying to convince myself more than him. "Just because our grandmothers were close friends does not mean everything is different." His voice was gentle but firm when he replied, "You saved my life, Julia, and now I finally understand why. It was not a coincidence. It was not luck. And it was not just your own natural bravery, though you have a great deal of that. It was something far older, something deeper. It was the bond between our two families calling out across the generations." The intensity of his gaze made it difficult for me to breathe. I had to look away, focusing my attention on the photograph, on the faces of 2 young women who had lived and loved and suffered in a world that was long gone. "Tell me about her," I said. "Lucia Duca. Tell me about the friendship that they had." And so he began to speak. For hours, we sat there in my small apartment as Matteo told me stories of Naples before the war, of two families who had built their empires next to each other, and of the powerful love between Caterina and Lucia that was stronger than blood or marriage. He talked about his great-grandmother with a surprising tenderness, showing a depth of character beneath his dangerous surface that I never would have imagined. I listened to him, asking questions, slowly piecing together the history that I never knew I was a part of. When he finally concluded his stories, the first pale light of morning was beginning to filter through my window. We had spent the entire night talking, and somehow, unbelievably, the terror that had pushed me to call him had been replaced by a completely different feeling. "You need to get some sleep," he said, getting up from the bed with a certain stiffness that showed he was just as exhausted as I was. "I will have men. You will not be bothered again." I escorted him to the door, suddenly not wanting him to leave. "Matteo." His name felt unfamiliar on my lips, more intimate than I had intended. "What is going to happen now?" He stopped in the doorway, his face partially hidden in shadow. "Now, we will honor the promise our grandmothers made. I will protect you, because I owe that to them, and I owe it to the man I am trying to become." His hand rose, and with an infinite gentleness, he brushed a stray piece of hair away from my face. "And maybe, if you are willing, we can discover what other things our families have left for us." He was gone before I could even think of a reply, leaving me standing in my doorway. The scent of his cologne hung in the air, and a photograph was pressed tightly against my heart. He returned the following evening, and then the evening after that one. He always arrived at the same time, right after the sun had set, when the city changed from the sharp light of day to something softer and more forgiving. He never gave any warning that he was coming, never made a call beforehand. He would just materialize at my door, holding coffee from the Italian bakery on Arthur Avenue, or carrying pastries carefully wrapped in wax paper. They were small gifts that felt incredibly significant because of the thoughtfulness behind them. We would sit together at my little kitchen table or out on the fire escape that looked over the street, discussing everything and nothing at all, creating something between. Matteo was not the person I had been led to expect. The stories I had heard about him, which came in whispered warnings from my coworkers and carefully chosen cautions from Marco, had painted a picture of a man who was ruthlessly calculating, who used violence without a second thought, and who had fought his way to power over the bodies of his enemies. And it was possible that those stories were accurate. I could see flashes of that other man sometimes, in the cold precision he used when giving orders on his phone, or in the way his associates treated him with a level of respect that was almost fear. But there was a different Matteo, a man who only appeared during the quiet moments we shared together. He could quote Dante from memory, and his accent would grow thicker with emotion while he recited verses his own grandmother had taught him. He laughed at my clumsy attempts to follow my Nona's recipes, and then he would roll up his sleeves to show me the right way to fold the dough, his hands moving with a skill that hinted at a hidden life at home. He listened intently when I spoke about my ambitions to start a small business one day, to create something that would be entirely my own. And he would ask me questions that proved he was genuinely interested in my answers. "Why did you choose to stay in this life?" I asked him one evening, while we were watching the sunset cover the Bronx with shades of gold and amber. "You are smart. You are educated. You could have been anything you wanted." He remained silent for a considerable time, looking out at the horizon with an expression that I found impossible to understand. "Because this is who I am," he finally answered. "My family created something here, something that is important to our community, even if the outside world considers it to be criminal. We offer protection to people who have no one else looking out for them. We resolve conflicts that the police choose to ignore. We are the ones they contact when the official system has let them down." He paused, and his jaw became tense. "And the violence? It is a necessary evil. I take no pleasure in it, Julia. Every single life I have had to take is a weight on me, even now, only for those who truly had it coming. In the world I inhabited, however, mercy was seen as a profound weakness, and weakness was a fatal flaw. He shifted to look directly at me, his gaze filled with a raw and difficult truth. I am not going to fake being a man I can never be. This is who I am. I am a person who commits terrible acts to shield the ones he loves. If that reality scares you, I would not blame you. A part of me knew it should have been terrifying. Every logical instinct in my mind was screaming that I was dancing with a raging fire. This dangerous connection could only lead to ruin. Yet when my eyes met Mateo's, I didn't see some kind of monster. I saw a man forged by a life he never asked for, shouldering weights that would have crushed a lesser person, battling to live by a code in a world that rewarded betrayal. I am not scared of you, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The wave of relief that washed over his features was so deep and so startling it made my own heart ache in response. He reached out for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine with a connection that felt both utterly new and deeply ancient, as if our souls had been reaching for each other across many lifetimes. My grandfather always said, "A man's true value is seen in the woman who chooses to stand with him," he confessed softly. I never truly grasped his meaning until this very moment. That instant hung between us, heavy with both immense possibility and imminent peril. I sensed what was coming next. I could feel the tension gathering, like the heavy air just before a thunderstorm breaks. And for the very first time in my entire life, I did not try to escape it. His kiss began as a gentle inquiry, a soft question instead of a forceful claim. His lips grazed against mine with a breathtaking tenderness, offering me every chance to retreat, to let caution win over my heart's desire. But I did not pull back. I leaned into him, answering his unspoken question with my own silent one. Something fundamental changed in the space between us. The kiss deepened, and his hand moved to cradle my jaw as his other arm drew me flush against him. For one flawless second, my entire world shrank to the taste of his lips and the solid feel of his body, the stunning rightness of being in that exact place at that exact time. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing far more heavily than we should have been. He rested his forehead on mine. "I have been alone for a very long time," he whispered. "Not because I had to be, but because I chose to be. In my life, connections are liabilities. To love someone is to give your enemies a perfect weapon they can aim right at you." His thumb gently stroked the curve of my jaw, and a shiver ran through me despite the evening's warmth. "But when I am with you, I find it impossible to remember why any of that was supposed to matter." "Perhaps it does not have to," I heard my own voice reply. "Perhaps some gambles are worth the risk." His laugh was quiet, almost regretful. "You have the same spirit as your grandmother." My Nonna always claimed she was the most courageous woman he had ever met, brave enough to have faith in love inside a world built to tear it apart. And was he correct? Did their love manage to survive? "She passed away in your grandmother's arms," he said, the words seeming to catch in his throat. "After the war, after losing absolutely everything, they reconnected here in America and lived out their final days together. My own family was convinced Lucia had lost her mind when she abandoned our compound to go live with that Romana woman in the Bronx. But I believe she simply recalled what was truly important in the end. The mental picture of two elderly women, survivors of war and devastating loss, and a separation that spanned decades, finding each other again at the close of their lives, brought tears to my eyes. It all made sense now. I finally knew why my nonna never mentioned the Ducas, why that entire chapter of her life was sealed away. The agony of losing Lucia again would have been too much to bear. Those memories were too sacred to be shared with anyone who had not been there. "They would be so happy," I said with a soft certainty, "that we have found each other." Mateo drew me into a tight embrace, his arms wrapping around me as if he could physically protect me from all the threats waiting just beyond this moment. They would call us absolute fools, he gently corrected. And they would be absolutely right. This is incredibly dangerous, Julia. Being seen with me puts a target squarely on your back. There is already a target on my back, I reminded him quietly. But at least this way, I am no longer facing it by myself. We remained on that fire escape until the first stars appeared in the sky, discussing the shared future we were carefully piecing together from the broken fragments of our individual pasts. He spoke of his intentions to make more of his enterprises legitimate, to pull his family's empire from the shadows and bring it into the open. I spoke of my aspirations to complete my education, to demonstrate that a Romano could find success without depending. Neither of us spoke of the glaring obstacles, of the rivals who wished him dead, of the society that would surely never approve of our union, or of the new danger that now shadowed both of our lives. For just one single night, we gave ourselves permission to believe that our love would be enough to conquer all. We would discover all too soon that it was not. The assault happened 3 days later. I was on my way home from the subway, my bag weighed down with textbooks, my thoughts consumed by an upcoming test. The street was calm, the sort of autumn evening in October that could make the Bronx seem almost serene. Dry leaves danced along the pavement like van until it silently pulled up next to me. The threat did not register until its side door slid open and rough hands shot out, yanking me violently inside. I fought back. My grandmother had insisted I learn how to fight. She had made certain I knew how to land a punch and how to break a man's grip. Those were lessons I had foolishly thought were pointless until that very instant. I scratched at the arms that held me, screamed with every ounce of air in my lungs, and thrashed and kicked with all my strength. But there were too many of them. They were too powerful, too skilled in this specific brand of brutality. A cloth was shoved over my mouth and nose, a sharp chemical smell filled my senses, and my entire world faded into blackness. When I came to, I was inside a warehouse. Harsh industrial lights threw long, menacing shadows across concrete floors that were stained with things I did not want to name. My hands were tied tightly behind my back, the coarse rope biting into my skin, and a dull throbbing pounded in my head from the drug they had used to knock me out. 3 men were standing nearby, conversing in Russian. I did not know the language, but I knew its sound from movies and the times I had seen Brighton Beach deliverymen at La Fenice. One of them saw that I was conscious and grunted something to his companions. Their laughter was a cruel sound that turned my blood to ice. "The Duca's woman," one of them said, his English thick with an accent. "Now we find out just how much he is willing to pay to have her returned." Raw fear tried to choke me, but deep beneath it, another feeling began to burn. It was anger. It was defiance. It was the unyielding Romano pride that my grandmother had drilled into me right alongside those self-defense lessons. I refused to grant them the pleasure of watching me break. "He will not pay a single dime," I said, my voice coming out much stronger than I felt. "I am nobody to him." The man who spoke before squatted down in front of me, his face uncomfortably close, his breath smelling of stale, cheap liquor. "We have been observing you, little girl. We saw him visiting your building. We saw him kissing you on that fire escape like some teenage boy in love. Matteo Duca does not kiss women who mean nothing to him." His smile was sadistic. "He will pay us, or we will return you to him in small pieces." The warehouse door suddenly exploded inward. Everything that followed happened in disjointed, violent flashes that my brain could barely assemble. Men swarmed through the entrance, all of them moving with the precise efficiency of soldiers. Gunshots ripped through the cavernous space, bodies crumpled to the ground, and standing in the middle of the chaos was Matteo. His face was a cold, furious mask I had never witnessed before, and I prayed I would never have to witness again. He eliminated the man who threatened me with no hesitation, with absolutely no mercy. Then he was beside me, slicing through my restraints, pulling me into his arms and whispering Italian words I was too dazed to comprehend. His hands roamed over my body, searching for injuries with a touch that was somehow both gentle and frantic. "Are you injured?" he demanded. "Did they touch you?" "I am all right." The words escaped as a sob. "I am all right, Matteo. I am okay." He lifted me from the ground as if I weighed nothing at all and carried me out of that warehouse. We went past the corpses of the men who had kidnapped me, past his own men who respectfully looked away. A car was idling outside, and he settled me into the back seat with a gentleness that was a violent contradiction to the carnage he had just unleashed. We drove in total silence, close to his side, shaking from the delayed reaction to the terror, as his hand methodically stroked my hair in a steady, calming motion. When we pulled up to his compound, a fortified estate in Westchester I had previously only glimpsed from a distance, he carried me through the doors and did not put me down until we were in a guest room decorated in calming shades of blue and cream. "You are safe now," he stated, his voice raw with emotion. "They will never lay a hand on you again. I promise you that, on my grandfather's soul." "How did you know where I was?" "The tracking device." He placed a soft kiss on my forehead. "I had a small one stitched into the lining of your coat the day after the break-in at your apartment. I know I should have—" His jaw clenched. "If I had arrived even 5 minutes later. But you did not." I lifted a hand to his face, feeling the rigid tension just beneath his skin. "You came for me. I will always come for you." The sheer force in his voice was nearly overwhelming. "Do you understand me, Julia? No matter what it costs, no matter what I am forced to do, you are now mine to keep safe." The possessiveness layered in those words should have set off alarms. Instead, it soothed something deep within my soul, filling voids I never even knew existed. In that very moment, surrounded by the clear proof of his capacity for both power and violence, I finally understood what it truly meant to be loved by a man as complex as Matteo Duca. It meant you were shielded, no matter the price. It meant you were cherished like a priceless treasure. It also meant you had to accept that the very hands holding you with such care were capable of horrific acts if your safety was ever compromised. "I am not going anywhere," I said with quiet resolve. "Not ever again." The profound relief that flooded his features could have shattered a heart. He pulled me into his arms, and I pressed my face against his chest, inhaling the mixture of gunpowder and fine cologne, the very essence of violence and tenderness woven together. We stood there that way for a very long time, two souls connected by a legacy of blood and a shared history, and by something far newer and more delicate that was blossoming between us against all odds. He breathed the words against my hair, a soft whisper. "Marry me." I pulled away, scanning his face for the slightest sign he was not serious. There was nothing. His expression was completely earnest, showing a vulnerability that I was certain few others had ever witnessed. I told him, "Matteo, not right now, not tomorrow, but one day. When all of this is finally over, and when I have made this world a place where you can walk without fear." His hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs gently wiping away tears I didn't even know I had cried. "Say you will marry me, Giulia Romano. Promise you will be my wife, my partner in life, and the mother of my children. Promise you will stand with me until our very last day." Those words seemed to echo in my head, mixing with the writing on that old photograph. Per sempre, together forever until the end. "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Yes, Matteo. Yes." When he kissed me, it felt like both salvation and immense danger, like a combination of everything I had ever run from and everything I had ever craved. As he embraced me there in that room bathed in a soft blue light, I was sure that no matter what happened next, we would confront it as one. Two families were at last reunited after generations of being apart. Two souls had discovered one another through the passage of time and shared. The outside world would probably call us complete fools. It would likely try to tear us apart. But we were a Romano and a Duca, the inheritors of a love that had endured warfare, terrible loss, and decades of complete silence. We were going to survive this as well. 6 months after that night, I was standing at the altar of St. Anthony's Church in Little Italy. I wore my grandmother's wedding gown, which had been preserved with care in tissue paper for 60 long years. The delicate lace was now a yellowish color from age, and the style was many decades out of fashion, but I could not imagine wearing anything else. It felt like my Nana's blessing from the afterlife, her silent approval of a union she must have somehow known was always meant to be. The church was crowded with guests who came from two different worlds. There were Matteo's business associates in their costly suits, and my classmates from the local community college. I saw elderly Italian women who had been friends with my grandmother and knew the Romano family name from the stories their own mothers had once told them. Father Joseph, the very same priest who had baptized me when I was a baby, stood at the front of the church. He wore a smile that seemed to show he also understood the historical weight of this special moment. And then I saw Matteo. He was waiting before the altar in a suit that I am sure cost more than a small car. His hair was perfectly swept back in his signature classic style. The gold chain around his neck, but it was the look on his face that truly took my breath away. The absolute love that was so clear in his eyes. The slight shaking of his hands when he reached out to take mine. The way his voice caught with emotion when he spoke the vows that would forever join our lives. I, Matteo Duca, take you, Giulia Romano, as my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. The words were perfectly traditional, exactly what one would expect, but the ones he spoke next were not. I promise you before God and before our families that I will use every last breath in my body to keep you safe. I will love you with a devotion that goes beyond the sins of my life. You are the illumination in my shadows, the calm within my chaos, and the very reason I struggle to be a better man. His voice lowered, becoming a private promise even with the church full of people. Our grandmothers made a vow to stand by one another until the very end. Today, I make that exact same promise to you, their beloved granddaughter, their enduring legacy, per sempre. Tears flowed freely down my cheeks while I spoke my own vows. I had written the words in the earliest hours of the morning during a night when sleep refused to come. I, Giulia Romano, take you, Matteo Duca, to be my husband. I am not the naive girl who accidentally fell into your world, but a woman who has witnessed both your darkness and your light, and chooses to embrace them both. I understand who you are. I understand what it means to love you. And I choose it anyway, without hesitation, completely, with every single part of myself. I squeezed his hands, feeling the solid strength in his fingers, the comforting steadiness that had become my safe harbor. My grandmother always taught me that love itself is an act of tremendous courage. Today, I am proving she was right. When Father Joseph declared us husband and wife, the eruption of applause that filled the church felt like it was closing a circle that had been left open for 3 entire generations. Matteo kissed me with the identical tenderness he had shown me on that first night on my fire escape, and with the same intense passion he had shown in the warehouse when he feared he was about to lose me forever. In that moment, something both ancient and new was sealed between us. At our reception, which was held in the back room of La Fenice, where our whole story started, I found myself standing in front of a table that was covered with old photographs. There was my grandmother with her friend Lucia in Naples, both so young and beautiful, filled with dreams that the coming war would soon destroy. There was my grandmother all alone in New York, forced to rebuild her life from absolutely nothing. I saw my own parents on their wedding day, my mother wearing a smile so much like my own. And finally, there was a picture of Matteo and me, representing the newest chapter in a family saga that went back for decades. Your grandmother would be so very proud, an elderly woman I did not know said to me. Her accent was heavy with the rhythm of her homeland. She always believed the Romanos and the Ducas were destined to find their way back to one another. She used to say, "Fate never forgets the promises it makes." I was surprised and asked her, "Did you know my grandmother?" The old woman smiled, and her eyes glistened with tears she held back. I was there on the night she and Lucia said their final goodbyes, the night that the war stole everything from all of us. I was also there when they rediscovered each other 50 years later, right on this very street. She gently pressed a wrinkled hand against my cheek. Some kinds of love are simply too powerful to be shattered by time, or distance, or even death. Yours is one of those loves, child. Do not ever question it. She then vanished back into the bustling crowd before I had a chance to ask for her name, leaving me with so many questions that I knew would likely remain unanswered. Matteo came to my side, slipping his arm around my waist. "You look like you're deep in thought." "I was just thinking about destiny," I confessed, "about how a single wrong text message somehow led to all of this." He gave a low, intimate laugh. "It was not a wrong message, Julia. It was the correct message, sent at the perfect time, to the exact right person." He leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to my temple. "My grandfather used to say that there are no such things as accidents in this life, only grand plans that we do not yet comprehend." I leaned my head against him, allowing his warmth to push away the persistent chill of my unanswered questions. All around us, the joyful celebration was still going strong. There were toasts being made in both Italian and English, and endless plates of food that my grandmother would have certainly loved. Music filled the air, making even the oldest of the guests want to tap their feet. This was my world now, this peculiar mix of ongoing danger and simple domestic life, a love that was forged in the fires of both violence and profound tenderness. Much later that night, long after the last guests had gone home and the staff had started to clean, Matteo guided me out to the alley where we had first stood 6 months ago. It was the place where he had waited for me in the darkness and completely altered the course of my entire life. "I have something special for you," he told me, as he reached inside his jacket. "A wedding present." He handed me a large envelope. Inside of it was the deed to a small building located on Arthur Avenue, the exact kind of space I had always imagined myself turning into a business of my own. "It is all yours," he told me softly. "There are no strings attached, and no obligations. No matter whatever happens between the two of us, that building will always belong to you." Your grandmother would have insisted that you have something that was truly and completely your own. The sheer generosity of this gift was almost too much to handle. I wrapped my arms around his neck, feeling his solid strength and the steady beat of his heart against my chest. "I love you," I whispered. "I know I do not say it nearly enough, but I truly do. I love you, Matteo Duca." His arms wrapped around me even tighter. "And I love you, Julia Duca." The name, my new name, felt like both a blessing and a heavy burden, a powerful symbol of everything I had just gained and all that I had put at risk. I was no longer just the struggling waitress who happened to spot I was now the wife of one of the most powerful and influential men in all of New York City. I was the inheritor of a legacy of love that reached back for generations, and the woman who had opened her hand and changed her fate with 5 simple, scrolled words. As we stood together in that alley, wrapped in a tight embrace while the city buzzed around us, I thought of the old photograph that was still on my dresser back home. 2 young women in Naples, promising they would stand by each other until the very end. Their long story had finally come full circle, and now our own was just beginning. That first year of marriage revealed things about myself that I never knew existed. I discovered that I could enter a room filled with dangerous men. And I could command their respect, not due to the wedding ring on my finger, but because I had earned it with actions they clearly understood. I discovered that deep love could exist right alongside constant fear, and that real tenderness could thrive in a world of violence. I saw how the same hands that were capable of killing to protect me could also hold me with an impossible gentleness through my worst nightmares. I finally understood that my grandmother had been correct about what courage is. It is not about being fearless, but about making the choice to act even when you are afraid. The building Matteo gave me on Arthur Avenue soon became Romano's, a small Italian bakery and cafe that served my Nana's treasured recipes to a neighborhood that was starving for authentic food. I would wake up before the sun rose each morning to start kneading dough and preparing the sfogliatelle that had been her signature dish. Those flaky pastries, which were filled with sweet ricotta cheese and candied citrus, always sold out completely before noon every single day. The work was incredibly demanding, and the hours were exhausting. But for the very first time in my life, I was creating something that was entirely mine. Matteo championed my independence with a kind of ferocity that truly shocked me. He made sure his name was not on any of the business paperwork, insisted that every single decision was mine to make, and he threatened severe bodily harm to any of his associates who dared to suggest that Romanos was just a cover for Duca family operations. Your grandmother did anyone's shadow. He confessed this to me one evening, his fingertips lightly tracing paths across my bare shoulder as we were intertwined in our bed. You were raised to be a source of light, he said. I refuse to be the one who ever extinguishes it. But the violent world he lived in had no regard for his honorable intentions. The Russian captors who had taken me were gone, completely eliminated. Their entire network had been taken apart in a brutal campaign of force that Matteo never spoke of, but which I followed through newspaper headlines. Even so, new threats constantly emerged, pushing up like weeds through solid concrete. A rival organization from Chicago saw an opening and what they thought was a moment of weakness. Then there was a compromised federal agent who started demanding payments to look the other way on certain matters. A nephew of a man Matteo had put in the ground years ago was now a grown man, and he was hungry for vengeance. Every single threat was met with the same kind of answer: immediate, absolute, and ultimately violent. I made an effort not to dwell on what Matteo did during his long absences, when he would vanish for days at a time and come back with dark shadows behind his eyes and a deep tension in his shoulders that only hours of my touch could begin to unravel. I tried my best not to keep a running count of the funerals I went to, where I stood at his side in a series of black dresses as he offered his condolences to the widows and orphans made by the brutality of his life. I tried to ignore how certain names simply ceased to be spoken after specific dates, completely removed from all conversation, just as they had been removed. But I always saw it. I never missed a thing. How can you live with it all? I finally asked him one night, while the autumn season was painting the trees outside our bedroom window in brilliant shades of fire. The incredible weight of everything you have done. He remained silent for a very long time, his gaze fixed on the ceiling with an expression that was impossible for me to decipher. The truth is, I do not, he eventually admitted. Not in any real sense. I just carry it, Julia. Every single life that I have taken, every family that I have shattered, and every decision that resulted in bloodshed instead of peace. I carry every one of them, each and every day, and I know I will carry them all until the day I die. He shifted his body to look at me, his dark eyes meeting mine with a kind of agonizing honesty. But I accepted that burden a long, long time ago. It is the cost of shielding what truly matters to me. And you, he said as his hand found mine, his fingers lacing through my own. You matter to me far more than my own conscience. That confession should have filled me with horror. Instead, it shattered my heart in a way I could not possibly articulate. This man, this incredibly dangerous, immensely powerful and terrifying man, had willingly sacrificed his very soul just to ensure my safety. How could I ever pass judgment on him for that when I was the direct beneficiary of every sin he ever committed? I just do not want you to lose who you are, I whispered. Not for my sake, not for anyone. His smile was filled with a deep, ancient sadness. I lost myself many years ago. Amore, you are not the cause of it. You are the only thing in this world that makes the loss feel bearable. Spring came, bringing with it both cherry blossoms and a persistent morning sickness. I found out I was pregnant on a Tuesday, as I stood in the restroom of Romano's holding a positive test in my shaking hands. The timing of it all felt terrible. The business was at last generating a profit. My relationship with Matteo had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The constant threats against our lives had finally calmed down to a level we could manage. A child would change absolutely everything, introducing another profound vulnerability into a life already overflowing. And yet, when I told Matteo later that evening, and I watched his face shift from pure confusion to dawning comprehension and then to an overwhelming profound joy, I knew without a doubt that I had made the correct decision. He immediately dropped to his knees in front of me, gently pressing his forehead against my still flat stomach, and began murmuring words in Italian that I was far too emotional to even attempt to translate. His shoulders shook with powerful sobs that he made no effort to conceal. I just ran my fingers through his dark hair, amazed by this man who could command an execution without so much as a flinch, but who openly wept at the simple idea of becoming a father. A baby, he breathed out, looking directly up at me with eyes that were shining with unshed tears. Our baby, a Romano and a Duca, finally brought together after all of these years of separation. The pregnancy went by without any complications, overseen by the very best doctors that money could possibly find and protected by men who would gladly die before allowing any harm to come near me. Matteo grew to be almost impossibly protective, constantly hovering near me like a watchful shadow. He personally sampled every single meal I ate and slept with one hand resting on my expanding belly, as if he could somehow protect our child from harm, even in his dreams. His intense obsession with my well-being definitely crossed into absurdity on more than one occasion. There were armed guards present at my prenatal checkups. Bulletproof glass was installed in all of the bakery's windows. He even had a panic room constructed inside our bedroom closet. "You are being completely ridiculous," I told him, completely exasperated after he insisted on coming with me to shop for maternity clothing. "No one is planning to attack me inside a department store. You cannot know that for sure," he countered, his eyes scanning the clothing racks with the exact same focus he likely used when surveying locations for potential ambushes. Enemies always attack when you are least expecting it. That is precisely what makes them our enemies. I just rolled my eyes but chose not to continue the argument. There was simply no way to win a debate against Matteo's deep-seated paranoia, not when it was about my protection. The assault happened during my 7th month. It was not against me, but against him. I was at the bakery when the telephone call came in, busy kneading dough for the following day's bread, with flour lightly dusting my swollen stomach and my aching back. It was Marco, Matteo's second in command. He delivered the terrible news in a voice that was deliberately emptied of all emotion. There had been a planned ambush. 3 of our men were dead, and Matteo had been shot 2 times before he managed to get away. The car ride to the hospital seemed to take place outside of normal time. I sat in the rear of the armored vehicle with my hands pressed firmly against my stomach, praying to every single saint that my grandmother had ever called upon. The baby was kicking wildly inside me, reacting to my own rising distress, and I whispered reassurances to him that I did not believe myself. "Everything is okay. Daddy is going to be just fine. All of us are going to be okay." Matteo was still in surgery by the time I arrived. A team of doctors was fighting to take out the bullets lodged in his chest and his shoulder. I had to wait in a private room that was filled with flowers and security guards. I watched the clock on the wall as it ticked away hours that stretched on for what felt like entire centuries. Marco brought me some food that I could not bring myself to eat, and water that I could not drink, along with updates that told me nothing at all, except that my husband was still alive, still in a fight for his life, and still refusing to leave me all alone in this world. When they finally permitted me to go see him, he was as pale as a ghost, with numerous tubes and wires linking him to machines that beeped and hummed with a cold, mechanical indifference. But his eyes fluttered open the moment I took his hand, and the smile that formed on his cracked lips was the single most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. "Julia," he whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse from the breathing tube that they— "And the baby?" "He is fine," I was able to say, as tears streamed freely down my face. "We are both perfectly fine. It is you that we are all worried about." He gave my hand a squeeze with a surprising amount of strength. "I told you before that I would always come back for you. Not even death itself can ever break that promise." His recovery was a very slow process, made more difficult by infections and various setbacks that pushed our endurance to its limits. I split my time between the hospital and the bakery, refusing to allow either one of my responsibilities to falter. In spite of the deep exhaustion that weighed down my every single step, the baby continued to grow larger and more active, demanding my attention with kicks and hiccups and late-night cravings that had guards scrambling all— And somehow, against all the odds, we made it through. Matteo finally returned home 6 weeks before my due date, looking thinner and much weaker than I had ever seen him, but he was alive. The men who were responsible for attacking him were taken care of in ways I never asked about. Their entire organization was simply absorbed into the Duca holdings. Their families were presented with a simple choice between showing loyalty or facing complete extinction. The process was brutal, it was efficient, and it was entirely necessary for our survival. It was the specific kind of justice that was normal in Matteo's world, the kind that I had slowly learned to accept without ever endorsing it. "I honestly thought I was going to lose you," I confessed one night, as I was curled up against his recovering body, being very careful. I was terrified that our daughter would never get the chance to know her own father. "Daughter?" His eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You found out the gender?" I smiled, gently pressing his hand against my stomach where our child was performing her nightly routine of acrobatics. "The doctors informed me last week. I wanted to hold off telling you until you were strong enough to really hear the news." I took a brief pause, trying to build up my courage. "I want her name to be Katerina, after my grandmother." The tears that instantly welled up in his eyes were all the answer I needed. "Katerina Lucia Duca," he repeated, his voice heavy with emotion. "For both of them," he said. "For the women who loved one another across different generations and across entire continents. And for the solemn promise they made to each other that ultimately brought the two of us together." Our daughter made her arrival on a beautiful spring morning, screaming her unhappiness at having been forced out of her warm and comfortable home. She had dark hair and light eyes, a flawless mix of both Romano and Duca heritage. Matteo held her with the very same sense of reverence that he had shown on the day of our wedding. His dangerous hands were impossibly gentle as he held her tiny body, and his eyes were filled with a love so incredibly fierce that it seemed to transform him completely. "Per sempre," he whispered softly to her, the promise now being passed down to another generation. "Fino alla fine, forever together until the very end." I stood there and watched them, my husband, my daughter, my unbelievable, improbable family. And in that moment, I finally understood what my grandmother had been trying to teach me for all of those years. Love was never meant to be safe. It was not rational, or convenient, or in any way easy. It was a conscious choice that you had to make again and again and again. You had to make it in the face of incredible danger and crippling doubt and a darkness that always threatened to swallow everything whole. but it was absolutely worth it. Every single risk, every single fear, every single moment of deep uncertainty, it was all worth it for this, for them, for the life we had built together. The epic story of the Romanos and the Ducas had its origins in Naples. It had survived a world war and a long separation and entire generations of complete silence. And now it was continuing in a nursery that was painted a soft shade of yellow, where a powerful mafia boss sang quiet Italian lullabies to his newborn, her heart more full than she had ever thought was possible. Some kinds of love truly were too powerful to ever be broken, and ours was certainly one of them. Some kinds of love truly are too powerful to ever be broken. And sometimes, the greatest stories begin with a single act of courage from someone who had no idea they were about to change everything. Thank you for staying with Julia and Matteo until the very end. If their story touched your heart, please hit the like button and leave a comment. Tell me, do you believe in fate? Do you think some people are destined to find each other? Share this story with someone who believes that love can survive anything, and do not forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our— This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.